Okay, so today we're going to continue reading through 1 Corinthians. We will not finish the book today. We will get to the next few chapters, chapters 8 through 11, of course, as we have numbered them. This covers the next section of 1 Corinthians. I said when you started these videos that 1 Corinthians is divided into chunks. Each chunk has kind of its own little subsection and its own structure and format within that subsection, and then they all kind of fit together to make a greater whole. The first chunk of 1 Corinthians was chapters 1 through 4 about the unity in the church and the strange cult of personality issues that were developing within the congregation as different groups were attaching themselves to different teachers based on their preferred speaking style or something along those lines. That was chapters 1 through 4. The chapters 5 through 7 were mainly about sex and trying to set their minds straight about proper sexual activity. Because remember, these would have all been pagans initially. I mean, there would have been a few Jews, but this was a predominantly Gentile church that came from a pagan background where sexual immorality was always more common than in the Jewish community. And then, so now we are entering the next section of 1 Corinthians, chapters 8 through 11. And this is going to be about matters of conscience as it relates to eating food sacrificed to idols. And in general, why and how this matters in terms of public appearance and propriety for worship. This section is somewhat outdated in our culture today because we don't really have a problem with food sacrificed to idols, per se. But some of the things that he's teaching in this section can very much still be relevant because he's basically instructing them on how to conduct themselves properly as Christians, as image bearers of God and as representatives of the Messiah's kingdom on earth. How to conduct themselves properly in the dark cultural world setting that doesn't follow God, that are not part of the Messiah's kingdom, and that still live in the realm of darkness and worship, whether they realize it or not, the heavenly forces that are opposed to God. So even though we don't really have to worry about going to a grocery store and buying meat that has been sacrificed to an idol today, we do have to worry about conducting ourselves properly in the sight of the people around us, both fellow believers and non-believers. Just to set the context here somewhat, of course, everyone in the ancient world offered sacrifices to their various gods. Even the Jews did that. God gave them a sacrificial system in Leviticus that he wanted them to follow in order to properly sacrifice their animals as part of their worship system at the time. We don't have to do that anymore, okay? We are not called today to sacrifice animals to follow God's prescribed worship system today as Christians, but they did back then, and not just the Jews, but everyone did. And in Corinth they would have. And it would have been everywhere. And in fact, and of course you're also talking about a different cultural time. I have all three cats after me now. Like they weren't bothering me until I started talking. Now they all have to come crawling around on me now. Due to the socioeconomic conditions of the ancient world, not many people would have had access to meat, period. I mean, I can go, there's a convenience store right behind this apartment building. I can go there right now and buy bacon and meat patties and turkey slices and all kinds of different things. It's processed. I mean, it's processed. But I can still go there and buy some meat right now, if I wanted to. But that wouldn't have been the case in the ancient world. You wouldn't have been able to just go to the store and buy some meat whenever you felt like it, unless you were wealthy, and most people weren't, okay? Because meat was not something that most people could afford. If you were going to eat meat, it likely would have been part of some kind of public ceremony or ritual or festival in which it would have been offered at a temple or somewhere thereabouts. Okay, so very, very, very likely the meat you would have eaten, if you eat meat at all, which again many people wouldn't have, at least not very often, very likely the meat you would have eaten would have been sacrificed in a temple and then offered up as in worship to an idol. Again, they did this in Jerusalem, the temple too. They would sacrifice animals, and then they burned some of them up to God. And some categories of sacrifices, the entire animal was burned up to God, and some categories of sacrifices, only part of the animal was burned up to God, and the worshipers and the priests got to eat the rest. And in these other temples, for example, the other temples that were in Corinth, similar thing would have happened. You would have brought your animal to sacrifice, and it would have been offered up to the god, and then you would have gotten to eat the rest of it. And whatever was left over then would have been sold to the marketplace, so that when people went to the marketplace to buy that meat, most likely that would have gotten there from the temple nearby. The temple would have had leftover meat that would have spoiled because there would have been too much for anyone to eat at the time it was made or cooked or prepared. So they shipped it to they sold to the marketplace, which in turn sold it to people who came along to buy things. So this meat that would have been sacrificed to idols would have been everywhere. Most of the meat you would have had to have looked long and hard to find meat that wouldn't have been sacrificed to idols. Jews who lived in communities throughout the Gentile world at this time would have had their own meat markets. But these aren't Jews. Like, these are Gentile Christians, and most likely the Jewish meat market that would have been in Corinth probably didn't want to sell to them because the Jews and the Christians weren't getting along at this point in time. So my guess is that the Gentile Christians could not go to the Jewish meat market to get meat because the Jewish meat sellers probably wouldn't have sold to them. But that is, so you would have had to have gotten your meat through other means, or just accepted the fact that this meat that you're eating would have been initially offered up in some temple somewhere. Now, you probably wouldn't have known unless you asked. Unless you actually, searched for the provenance of this animal, like asked the meat seller where it came from, and then went to the temple guy who sold it to the meat seller and asked what sort of sacrifice it was part of. Unless you had done that, you wouldn't have known. And Paul will say, just eat it. Don't worry about where it came from. That's one of his solutions is to people is to just say, just eat it. Receive it with thanksgiving. If they put it in front of you, eat it and receive it with thanksgiving, and don't bother yourself with where it came from. That is one of the solutions he puts forward. Because you really wouldn't have known unless you made an effort to find out where it came from, which you probably could have if you really had wanted to. But it would have generally been understood that the meat they would have been eating initially came from some temple sacrifice. Some animal would have been sacrificed. Part of that meat of that animal would have been offered up to the temple or eaten there, and then the leftover would have been sold to the marketplace, and that's what you're eating now. Or else you're going to an actual festival, and the meat is being offered right there. Again, this is different from what we experience in our culture. But there are some principles here that do overlap. So we will talk about those as we go on. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we possess all knowledge. This is another one of those instances, and there have been a few of these already in 1 Corinthians, and there will be more to come, where he is most likely quoting back something that he knows that they're saying. This is one of those areas where not having punctuation, like quotation marks and periods, can be kind of difficult. In modern day formatting, we would be able to tell much more clearly whether or not Paul is simply quoting back something to them that they've already said. But in this original, of course, they would know that. First, the Corinthians themselves would know that. If he is repeating their own words back to them, they would know that because they would have said it in the first place. But we don't have their original correspondence to him. We don't know exactly what they would have said or what they were saying. So we have to infer what they were saying and how Paul is responding to them from this letter itself. But again, there are no quotation marks, no punctuation, no grammar, not even any line indentations, except for in poetry sections maybe, to help us understand exactly where someone is speaking or if someone stops speaking. That's just one of the things about ancient languages. But most likely, he is repeating something back to them that they've already said. And he is now going, and so they've been saying most likely, we know that we possess all knowledge. We all possess knowledge. Okay, we're smart. We know what we're doing. We know how to handle this. That's probably what they're saying. So he's going to have to tweak their attitude a little bit here. So he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So you can get arrogant in your knowledge, and that's very easy to do. The more you know, the more likely it is, honestly, for you to be arrogant with how much you think you know. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. That is a lesson that a lot of people in our culture today need to learn. We have a lot of people today who are very impressed with their own smarts, very impressed with their own knowledge. We saw that during COVID now, didn't we? A lot of people who went to bed thinking about themselves how smart they are, and they weren't very smart at all. But the man who loves God is known by God. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. We know that an idol is nothing at all in this world, and that there is no God but one. Again, he might be saying this himself, or he might be repeating something back at them. Now, he's true. He would agree. Even if he is repeating something back that they've already said, he would agree with this. He knows that idols are nothing. The Old Testament makes a big deal about that, of course. And there's no God but one. So Paul, even if this is something that they said that he's repeating back to them, he would agree with it. I'm not sure, though. He may be saying this himself, but he may also be quoting back something that they already said. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. We're talking about like the Aphrodites and the Zeuses and the Poseidons. You know, my brother-in-law and I are planning to go to see the next Gladiator movie tomorrow. I just got done actually watching the first one a few minutes ago, the Russell Crowe one, which takes place in ancient Rome. That's the time period in which this is, it's 100 or so years later, and of course it's a made-up story. But that would have been the era in which they would have been worshiping the very famous pantheon of Greek gods. So there are all these named figures. I mean, Corinth would have had temples to Aphrodite and to other, Poseidon and to other gods. So there, these things exist, but are they real? Well, or what are they? As indeed there are many gods and many lords. Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came, and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came, and through whom we live. So Jesus was he was the active agent in creation. Which the Gospel of John makes that clear too. That Jesus was the Word spoken at the beginning that put the world into being for the sake of God the Father. But not everyone knows this. I thought I was hearing something weird there for a minute. Not everyone knows this. We know this. We do know this. Paul knows this. The Jews have always known this. Well, they don't necessarily know about Jesus per se. But the pagans out there don't know this. And the Corinthian Christians know this now. But not everyone knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, because most likely it was. And since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and we are no better if we do. Now, this would have taken, I don't know how difficult this would have been for Paul to accept as a person during his own life. We read about Peter and his awakening to the need to evangelize the Gentiles back in Acts chapter 10. Okay, when he was summoned to go to Cornelius' house, and he saw this vision of a sheep being lowered from heaven with all kinds of animals that represented unclean foods, unclean animals. And he was told to eat them, and he said, no, I'm not going to eat these foods. And, and nothing has ever entered him. Even at that point in time, Peter still did not eat non-kosher food. Okay, and it was a struggle to get him to realize that food is food. Okay, that was Peter. That was a Galilean fisherman who hung out with Jesus for 3 years. Okay, Paul was the strictest of the strict in the Pharisees. He would have been the most cross your I and dot your T, dot your I's and cross your T's, rule follower of all. So you know that he would have been big on the food rules when he was a Pharisee. And here he is saying, 20 years later or whatever, saying that it doesn't matter what you eat. You're no better off. You're no worse off if you don't eat, no better if you do. And this isn't even talking about unclean food according to the Jewish food laws. This is talking about meat that's a sacrifice to an idol. I don't know. We don't really read anything about that anywhere in the scriptures, whether in Acts or in Paul's own letters. We don't really have any indication of just how momentous a mind change this would have been for him, but it would have been. Going from what he would have been before to what he is now is a tremendous, tremendous shift in thinking. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone with a weak conscience, and again, he may be saying weak in quotation marks. That may be a word that they are using, that he is using too, or maybe he's making this up on his own, without modern day formatting rules, and without knowing what the Corinthians themselves were saying. We really don't know for sure. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you who have this knowledge eating in an idol's temple, because you could go to the temple and eat, like that would have been the primary way of getting meat. Again, most people would not have been buying meat on their own. If you're going to eat meat, most likely you're going to go to a temple to do it. Or you would have been buying it secondhand in the marketplace, but we're not even talking about that. We're talking about actually going to the temple and eating it there. So if you think you're so strong, and you think that this isn't a problem because you know that the idol that temple worships isn't real, okay, well that's true. It's not real. That is true. All right. So maybe you can go in there and eat that meat without having a problem in your own mind. But maybe someone else who used to go here regularly to worship and engage in all kinds of pagan revelry, maybe that person has a problem with it. And maybe you shouldn't exercise your freedom to do that if it means that you're damaging the conscience of the person next to you who can't go in there so easily and freely without problems. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you who have this knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. You're going to be tempting him back into sin. You're going to be luring him back into the idolatrous lifestyle he used to be a part of. When you sin against your brother in this way and wound his weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, you can sin against your own conscience. We'll read about in Romans that is a type of sin. Okay? We all were made in the image of God, so we all have some inner moral compass that points us in the direction of right or wrong, simply by being due to virtue of being made in the image of God. Animals don't have that. Okay? My cats here, a big fat one down there, and then that one, the skinny one, and then the crazy one over there. Like, my cats have no conscience. They have no concept whatsoever of right and wrong. Never have, never will. Okay? No animal does. But humans do. Some of them is messed up, okay? The human conscience can be easily corrupted because humans are corrupted. But we all do have some kind of an inner moral compass or an inner conscience helping us distinguish between right and wrong that we have by virtue of being made in God's image. And you can sin against your conscience. And that is a kind of sin. You can sin against God. You can sin against the law of your whatever state or community you belong to, which is, again, a kind of sin. And you can even sin against yourself. You can sin against your own conscience. We'll read about that more when we get to Romans. So when you sin against your brothers in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so I will not cause him to fall. So he's saying that, yeah, you have a point in that these idols don't really exist. You can go in, you can eat this meat and not think of it as being offered to an idol, because the idols aren't real. There's one God. He made everything. He made this meat to begin with. And he'll get back to this point in chapter 10 when he wraps this discussion up. But the idea is that yes, you can eat this meat without causing yourself to sin. Okay, it is meat that comes from God. It doesn't matter whether it's a sacrifice an idol or not, because the idols aren't real. But be careful how you do that, because you can do it completely conscience-free and with full thanksgiving to God. But maybe not everybody can. Maybe you have someone next to you who used to go to that very temple and engage in all kinds of dark pagan revelry there. Maybe you shouldn't go there and eat there. Again, we don't really have this issue in our culture today. I think the closest example that I can come up with would be drinking, okay, or going to bars or places like that, which themselves, okay, you can drink. God gave wine. He gave the grape. All right, the grape comes from God. Wine comes from the grape. All right, and there are places in Scripture where Jesus came eating and drinking. The Son of Man came eating. He turned the water into wine, and it was the best wine they'd ever had. All right, he even said that John the Baptist did not come eating and drinking, so he was an ascetic. He practiced an abstinence lifestyle, but Jesus didn't. Jesus came eating and drinking. He went to parties. He went to feasts. Okay, he endorsed heavy wine. He created wine. But there are people today who have a history, whether in their own individual lives or maybe in their family history, a serious problem with wine and alcohol. And maybe for them it is not a good idea to go to a place where such drinks are served, such beverages are served, or engage in feasts or parties or festivities where such drinks are likely to be served. And maybe you then should serve as an example to that person and refrain from doing so yourself. You may have the right to do that. You may have the freedom to do that. And maybe you could exercise that freedom responsibly if it was up to you. But maybe it's not always up to you. Maybe you have to consider some of the people who are with you and whether or not your right and your freedom will be damaging to them. And in the end, and that's where it goes back to the whole thing about knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. You can know in your mind, you can have the knowledge that you have freedom to eat this meat or drink this alcohol, and it's fine. And that may puff you up. That's good knowledge to have, but that can puff you up, and maybe you're hurting others around you who are in a weaker state of their conscience, or have other hang-ups or issues that could flare up that maybe you don't have. I don't have a problem with alcoholism. Okay, I don't drink alcohol, but my conscience would not forbid me from drinking alcohol in a social setting. In terms of my own ability to handle it, okay, or my own awareness of what I'm doing. I don't believe it's a sin. All right. I don't do it. I don't seek to engage in it. But I would not have physical or moral or spiritual or ethical hang up over it. But some people would. Okay, some people would not be able to do that as freely and securely as I could. And that's something I have to consider. And so for basically the same reason, I don't engage in this activity. Not so much for my own sake, but for the sake of not damaging people around me. Now, he's going to continue with this topic. Okay, this is going to go clear to the end of chapter 10 and even bleed over into chapter 11. But chapter 9 is going to be about something else, but he's not getting away from this. Okay, it's going to seem like a digression into something else, but it really isn't. He's going to be talking about himself and using himself as an example to help illustrate his point of getting the Corinthians to see that maybe sometimes they should choose not to exercise their rights and their freedoms. Okay, so he's going to be talking about himself for a while, which he tends to do. Paul talks about stuff a lot, but he's not losing his train of thought. He's wandering into a digression in order to help set up his main point about what he's really talking about in regards to this food sacrificed to idols issue.